Greetings. I'm Carl Nightingale. Welcome back to Urban History and Earth Time, a six-part video lecture based on the keynote I gave at the European Association of Urban History in Ostrava, Czechia in September 2024. After some introductory remarks contained in the first video, we're now going to jump into Chapter 1, entitled Power, Energy In, Power Out. As urban historians, we're pretty explicit when we talk about space, urban, and time, history, but we are less explicit about power. If, however, we define power as the capacity to change both space and time, power seems to deserve full consideration as a third axial dimension of our work. In so doing, we also will mirror the key concerns of the Anthropocene debate. In urban historical parlance, power is everywhere, yet in a sense it's nowhere. In other words, we do little to specifically elaborate the relationship between urban history and power. Largely, I suspect, this is because power, understandably, gets swallowed up in discussions of historical causality. One thing that Anthropocene does right is that it asks us to be more explicit about power. It starts with a power deployed by one species, humanity, vis-a-vis geophysical and extrahuman biological forces. The debate about the Anthropocene in the humanities is also correctly focuses on the unequal distribution and deployment of human power, particularly the concentration of power in imperial states, capitalist firms, racialized inequalities based on slavery and settler colonialism, and concentrations of power produced by patriarchal practices across most human societies. For urban historians, the question comes down to the power of a particular kind of space, cities, and I would argue the concentration of human power in that space, and with it the increased capacity to change space more generally as well as time, through the amplification of power and the deployment of power in that same space. As is often pointed out, most of us inhabit these spaces, urban ones, today. More importantly, though, from the beginning, we designed cities explicitly to allow us to deploy more of our species' power, while often also designing them to allow fewer of us to deploy more of that city-amplified power than the majority in the city. Hannah Arendt once wrote boldly that cities are the material basis of power. I'm not sure that urban historians have decided, as a scholarly community, whether we believe that or not. We have dozens of metaphors for the power that we wield in cities, and they are all over the place. When cities are seats or nodes or territories of power, they don't appear to actually produce power. They're just places where power is, or where it flows. When we say that cities are arsenals of power, or cradles, crucibles, workshops, tools, or engines of power, or powerhouses, they appear to take various degrees more agency in the production of human power. We often use the name of a capital city like Beijing or a neighborhood like Wall Street or Hollywood as a metonym for state, corporate, or cultural power, also implying a central role for cities in power production and employment. Maybe this ambiguity about power is healthy. We're right to be leery of something we might call monocausal spatial determinism. We shouldn't let our excitement about cities lead us to proclaim that cities cause everything or that they are equivalent to power. Nonetheless, the question of power is linked up to the question whether cities are themselves, as spaces, in fact a causal force in history. And by being inexplicit or ambiguous, we leave a lot of questions out. How important exactly are cities to human power and to human history? When, where, and why? How do we characterize cities' relationship to other things that contribute to human power? Institutions like empires, corporations, plantations, or patriarchal families, or social movements, or collective human acts like migrations and reproduction that are less institutionalized or organized. What specific things about cities account for their contribution to human power and its distribution, unequal and otherwise? Did the importance of cities to power change over time, and if so, when? How do we measure any of this anyway? There's a lot of historiography that matters to these questions, mostly consisting of arguments about the most important moving forces of history. That's pretty familiar to us all, so I'm going to skip to my own conclusions about power in cities, which can be summed up as this. We need to update the old Greek concept of polis. Let's remove it from its specific and very problematical historical context in ancient Greece and redesign it as a concept that highlights cities as a spatial form of human power. In cities, we produce, amplify, and deploy human space in ways that allow us to produce, amplify, and deploy all other forms of human power. We do this, I think, not by elevating any one form of power to preeminence, but by means of intensified dialectical interactions between all forms of human power. This diagram tries to give a visual representation of what I mean. The interlocking circles are meant to convey that the principal acts of human politics, economics, culture, technology, and demography, listed around the outside, and the principal collective and usually unequal means by which we deploy power in each of these realms, listed in the squares, are at once their own thing and intrinsically dependent upon dialectical interchanges with each other. None of these things exist without the other. By putting cities at the center of the diagram, I'm also suggesting that cities were originally designed, for the most part successfully, precisely to augment the capacities of each of these power-deploying phenomena, as well as the energy of their dialectical interaction. This is the concept of polis I suggest we adopt as the basis for discussions of urban history and Earth time. It conveys both of the two central concepts that English and other languages derive from the Greek word polis, city and power politics, and suggests that producing space is a necessary, if not sufficient, force in the dialectical production of human power. This concept of polis also associates cities with social complexity, the term social scientists typically use for dialectical interchanges like this. While I don't dispute the complexity of these dialectics, let alone the unpredictability they bring to acts of deploying power, another complex dimension, my main point is to arrive at the role of space, not in producing complexity, but in producing human power itself. A less observed meaning of polis that we can borrow from the ancient Greeks is the idea that the city-energized dialectic of power cannot exist without what I'll call energy, that is, power generated by the sun, conveyed to Earth, moderated and diversified in various ways by Earth's atmosphere, hydrosphere, lithosphere, cryosphere, and biosphere, and from there further captured by humans in all of our own habitats, including in cities. Our diagram of the polis must be widened, in other words, to represent cities in nature, as it were, or cities as natural human habitats or ecosystems. We need to include all of the forms of geosolar energy inflows that make any human act, or dialectic, or the power derived from it, remotely powerful, no matter where it happens. Finally, our updated concept of polis must include the Earth and the Sun, which, the Greeks also knew well, are at the origin of all of these things. To put this another way, cities have always existed on a planet. They have always been made of a planet. A planet and a star have always given them everything, including their human inhabitants, and they have always existed at the mercy of that planet and that star. This concept of polis, as updated, allows us to begin coming to terms with the central challenge of the multiple predicaments of our own time, namely that human power, as amplified and deployed in cities over 6 millennia, has now accelerated in force to the point where it not only feeds on geosolar energy, it is now as capable of altering the mechanisms that regulate and absorb geosolar energy for all uses, human and otherwise, on Earth. So much so that human power now rivals other geophysical and biological Earth systems that, until recently, have held virtually absolute power to transform energy into all the things that make cities and all human life and all non-human life possible. Okay, that's chapter 1, power generated from energy by means of the human polis, re-theorized and updated for our perilous moment in Earth time. But how does this work? Why is space important to power? How, as the word polis helpfully suggests, do spaces and power co-create each other? And why are cities our foremost space for enacting this co-creation? It's time for Chapter 2, Space, How the Urban Became Planetary.